Howdy friends, this is PelicanMan bringing you another Death and Taxes video. For anyone who watched the last video, we're running back the exact same list. This is the Black-White Overlord of the Balemurk Taxes list. For anyone who didn't watch the last video, I'll just quickly go over what the deck's about. Overlord of the Balemurk is a very powerful card that for 2 mana comes into play and provides a lot of card advantage, but it's not a creature until 5 turns later. If we can flicker it, it becomes a creature as soon as it comes back into play. So the plan is to utilize a lot of 2-card synergies, so Overlord synergizes with Phelia or Flickerwisp to be able to cheat it into play and let it be a 5/5 as soon as possible, similar to what old Taxes lists were doing with Stoneforge cheating Calendar into play. Phelia also works really nice with Recruiter of the Guard, where you can flash Phelia in at the end of your turn 2, untap, jam Recruiter, you can shoot it for 2 cards straight away. Aether Vial is really nice with Recruiter, letting us recruit something and then immediately drop it into play. Plus, it just utilizes all of our card advantage with things like Overlord of the Balemurk, letting us put all the cards we draw into play and actually progressing it to the board. Solitude's always been a very powerful card. We have lots of different flicker effects that are going to let us keep reusing it, and even if we pitch cast it, Overlord of the Balemurk is going to keep buying it back. Same with Emperor of Bones, who synergizes really well with all the other cards, but is kind of more connect tissue than anything. That if our opponent disrupts us in any way, if we're trying to assemble Failure plus Overlord of the Balemurk and they disrupt us, Emperor of Bones can, recur the Failure, which can then flicker the Balemurk. It kind of, our opponents have to interact with us. If they don't, we get really good card advantage. If they do interact with us, Emperor of Bones can kind of fill the gap there. The other benefits to having black, we get Fatal Push as extra removal, we get Boggart Trawler, it's for more kind of utility and land spot along with their Witch Enchanters. And yeah, otherwise this is like a Death and Taxes version of Splinter Twin, where we're really trying to assemble our combo. Except Splinter Twin, you have to flash in your 3-drop and then untap and play your 4-drop. We're trying to flash in our 2-drop and untap and play our 2-drop. So the things that are the most questionable deck is the mana base. This is not like the mana base I've seen other people playing. I am trying to test a few things. I really like White Orchid Phantom in the main deck in the current meta, so I've got Flagstones of Trokair in my mana base, so worst case I can combo with myself. And I also like the idea of having 4 fast lands to make our mana base as painless as possible, because that was always one of the advantages of Death and Taxes, was that we didn't run fetches, shocks and all that, whereas now we currently are, plus the MDFCs that hit us for 3 damage if we want them to come into play untapped. So I'm trying this meta base, stress testing it, seeing how it goes. So far so good, but we'll see how it goes in this league. And then in the sideboard we have a good artifact hate package with Kataki and 2 Stony, which a lot of those matchups, plus the energy matchups, we've got Wrath of the Skies, we've got the 2nd and 3rd copies of Aven Interrupter, spot one in the main deck because it's really good in the meta right now against all the X spells. We have the 4th copy of White Orchid Phantom because we couldn't find room to fit in the main deck. And then the black sideboard cards, Surgical, we could run in mono white as well, and we probably would in this current meta. It is just very good against all the graveyard strategies that have popped up now thanks to Faith Sleeping getting unbanned. Same with Faerie Macabre, it is a black card, but we could still run in mono white since its utility is being discarded from the hand. And as I said in the last video, this is maybe the strongest card in the sideboard because you just get to keep reusing with Overlord of the Balemurk. Even if your opponent's like a living end deck, you just get to chew away at their graveyard bit by bit, which is really nice without needing to dedicate to a card like Rest in Peace or Sanctify in deck, which actually works against us because we do actually have black cards in our deck now. And lastly, for combo matchups and everything, and even maybe some fair matchups, Thoughtseize is a really nice tool to have access to that mono white Death and Taxes definitely did not. So that is the list. And with that said, let's get into a lead. We're on the play against Omnath. So our opponent leads Green Sun Zenith into Dryad Arbor, and we Fatal Push the Dryad Arbor. So our opponent would have got a nice advantage there, the ramp off Green Sun Zenith, but we get to counteract it. And I play White Orchid Phantom here, mostly because I have nothing else to do except holding up Solitude Scam and just try and deny their colors of matter to keep them off domain by using White Orchid Phantom. Here the Vial's a bit late, but we're still happy to play it because this game should get pretty grindy. So we get to play the Vial, hold up Solitude Scam if we choose to use it. Our other option was playing the Recruiter, but I think this lets us use the Recruiter better later on. Our opponent has Ren and 6, so the White Orchid Phantom looks like it's not going to get too much value this game because our opponent can just keep getting the lands back with the Ren and 6. And they have Prismatic Ending for our Aether Vial. We draw the Concealed Courtyard, which isn't great as it would be a tap land here. I choose to get Witch Enchanter and bolt it in so that we do have an untapped land. So that is a position where the Courtyard's an untapped land maybe gives us the ability to get something more relevant with the Recruiter. But our plan is here to hold up the Ephemerate in case we need it, and potentially in future turns be able to Solitude Scam with it. Our opponent has Fable, which is going to get them pretty good card advantage. Yeah, so if the Courtyard was an untapped land and we drew our 5th land, we might have had Hardcast Solitude up. We choose to go for Ephemerate here, try and take out our opponent's Trine, which I'm assuming is their only black source. And when the Ephemerate rebounds, I would have been able to Ephemerate the Recruiter of the Guard, but my opponent chooses to pitch cast a Solitude here to effectively counter my Ephemerate. We do top deck the 5th land, which is untapped, which is nice, so we get to hard hardcast our Solitude, which I choose to do at sorcery speed to get rid of the token so that Recruiter can attack in. I choose not to go for the Ren and 6, which might have been a mistake, because if I get it to 3, then the Solitude maybe gets to take it out next turn, but my opponent's getting relatively low, so I choose to just try and go for them here. They Grandson Zenith for a Nissa, which is going to generate a good amount of mana and card advantage for them. They find Flage, so the deck is kind of interesting because they've got access to Flage, and they've got a Traxxer in their deck, which isn't something I expect to see, so very interesting what the Omnath decks are up to now. I pop Silent Clearing to try and see what I can find, end up with just Failure and Aether Vial, and our opponent plays out Omnath, and we are just getting drowned in card advantage right now, and we're in top deck mode with not a lot of cards that really get us out of this spot, so I choose to just scoop it up here, save some clock for the next 2 games because these matches tend to go grindy, and let's get on to game number 2. Sideboarding against the Omnath deck, I wanted to bring in Aven Interrupters because I saw Green Sun Zenith, and otherwise just a good card in that kind of a matchup, I feel. Faerie Macabre, which is, we don't really want access to Surgical, but Faerie Macabre getting to fight Ren and 6 feels pretty good, so going for that. Plus, we did see a Traxxer game 1, so just in case they're trying to reanimate in some way, I wanted some kind of graveyard hate. And the 4th White Orchid fans, because their mana base, they're going to have a fair few basics, but their mana base is also going to require colors to get domain and stuff, and to cast Omnath, so disrupting it feels really good. And for cutting, we're trimming an Aether Vial because they have Leyline Binding and Prismatic Ending, assumedly, and things like that, so Aether Vial's not likely to stick around, but we still do want access to it potentially. And 3 Fatal Push, which is not great against them, but like, I've realized looking at it now that it does kill Dryad Arbor and can kill Omnath if you get Revolt, so maybe worth considering keeping in, but this is how I did decide to board, so let's get into game number 2. Game number 2, we're on the play again. We choose to keep what is kind of a 5-lander, although Boggart Trawler can be a spell, and Shadowy Backstreet will dig us towards stuff, but Aether Vial is also kind of mana generation, so it's a bit risky, but we're hoping the strength of Aether Vial gets us there. And we do like seeing Aven Interrupter in the opening hand here as well. We just hope to maybe start progressing to the board a little quicker. We get White Orchid Phantom, which we could use to blow up our opponent's Dryad Arbor or Temple Garden, but neither are really going to take them off colors, so I choose to just ramp myself here. This means if we start top decking some of our good card advantage or things like Solitude, we can start using them a lot quicker. Plus it pulls more lands out of the deck to hopefully improve our top decks. Our opponent had the Flage for the Phantom, but that's fine. It had kind of already done its job. And here we just top deck another land. So the nice thing is I do get to play my Surveyor land and keep an Emperor of Bones on top. And our opponent's nowhere near escaping Flage, so I don't need to play out the Boggart Trawler to get rid of their graveyard just yet. So instead I get to hold up Aven Interrupter. Plus the Boggart Trawler is particularly vulnerable to Ren and 6, so especially nice if we can take the Vial up to 3 next turn and use it there. Our opponent plays Fable, which is kind of a perfect card to interrupt with Aven. Takes away their whole turn, and now I have a threat in play. So the Vial's up on 3 now. I get the Emperor of Bones. And here I just choose to Emperor of Bones, get rid of their Flage, which gives me the option to activate it, adapt it at instant speed, and have a Lightning Helix, which I do decide to do in the second main phase because I realize if our opponent starts holding up like Leyline Binding or anything, I might lose access to this, so just slows them down. Same as if I brought back the Phantom, but actually takes them off full land. Might have bottom for our Aether Vial, so we will just throw the Boggart Trawler in here and start really putting some pressure on them, which the Boggart Trawler is not as relevant here, but we did get rid of 3 lands from our opponent's graveyard, so it does make future Ren and 6s potentially not have targets. And we draw Flickerwisp, so there is an option to Flickerwisp the Emperor of Bones here to remove the counters so we can potentially use to recur something else later, which might have been a good option. Instead I've chosen to hold on to it in case I top deck something that I want to get value out of, but I think that might have been a mistake because I top deck Overlord of the Balemurk, and I have the option to Impending the Overlord and Flickerwisp to cheat it into play. And it does have binding to deal with our 4/4, which is fine. We still get to hit him with the Aven. But yeah, I choose to hardcast the Overlord of the Balemurk. My decision had kind of been made pre-combat, but then our opponent tapped out for the binding, so maybe it was better to just put the multiple bodies in play here. And our opponent has a Nissa, and they do get another Fable out, but they are in danger because our Aven Interrupter is looking pretty threatening. They pitchcast Solitude to get rid of Overlord, which Overlord's obviously very good, but they are dying in the air. So I'm impending the Overlord here just to kind of get information about what I might want to do with my turn. So I have 2 Phantoms that I've gotten back. I could play those out, which is what I was initially thinking, because it would put multiple lethal threats into play, but I realized my opponent's got no cards in hand, so Flickerwisp and the Overlord, they have to top take a removal spell for Flickerwisp, and then the Overlord's going to get value, so I do also go for that. The Overlord finds a Recruiter of the Guard. My opponent gets to dig here for an answer to Flickerwisp. They cast Omnath, and cast Malevolent Rumble, and seemingly didn't hit removal spell or land at all there, so kind of lucky for us they didn't draw it out to the Flickerwisp, so maybe it was better to play the 2 Phantoms the previous turn, but we get there regardless, so we get to go to game number 3. Game number 3, we're on the draw. We have an early Aether Vial with a bunch of the cards we kind of like seeing in the matchup anyway, so, which I suppose the way we've boarded kind of every card's pretty good to see here. So we start off with the turn 1 Vial, and we did draw into the Overlord. So this is going to be our turn 3 combo kill, essentially. Not kill, but turn 3 combo. Our opponent has Prismatic Ending for our Vial. My opponent taps out for Omnath, and I could jam Overlord here and just punish them for tapping out. But Recruited Guard for Solitude felt more necessary because I wanted to make sure I hit Solitude to deal with the Omnath, because the Omnath is what's going to give them really good card advantage, whereas my Overlord can come down later and still get card advantage. They're in a position now where they have to kill Failure in case I have an Overlord, and even if they do, I've gotten 2 cards off this Recruiter. The Recruiter's going to stay in play. I've got an Overlord coming down next turn. If I draw a land, I've got Emperor of Bones for the Solitude. So I think my decision was correct, plus it optimized the use of our mana, where we spent 3 mana this turn, and if we draw a land next turn, we can potentially use all 4 mana next turn, kind of optimizing rather than leaving up a mana that we're not going to use. Our opponent does have Flage for a Failure. We draw another Emperor of Bones. Here I'm playing Overlord of the Balemurk. My hope was that I would hit a land drop here, because we do have 3 lands that are creatures for the Overlord. Otherwise, just getting the card advantage going, or potentially a white card to pitch to Solitude. But we did hit a land, so the Emperor of Bones, we're not going to get to activate it, but the idea was we just wanted to eat the Flage, and again, optimize utilizing our mana as effectively as possible. They Solitude our Emperor of Bones here by hardcasting, which is scary that we're in that part of the game where they're starting to hardcast the Solitudes. But the other advantage of finding that land off the Overlord is that I can potentially hardcast Solitude here, but the more fun line actually is just play out Emperor, exile my Solitude, adapt Solitude their Solitude, and get to attack for some lifelink. And now we've got a 4/4 Emperor of Bones in play, which is a big enough creature that it's almost a must answer as well, which feels like how this matchup goes. They've got a lot of dead air and things like Delighted Halfling and potentially even Ren and 6, and we've just got cards that has so many must answers. Things like Recruit of the Guard, not so much, but Emperor of Bones, Failure, Overlord. My opponent has an Omnath here, and it's really scary that they're fetching straight away to get all this mana, which they do just use to play at a Fable, which is a good card, but I feel like Overlord's the better card advantage card here in this matchup. Here, similar to at the start of the game, we are going to get Solitude into play, get rid of their Omnath, and attack him with Emperor of Bones, and start trying to finish our opponent off here. Our opponent's Fable bins 2 lands, they get in with the Goblin. I choose not to trade with the Solitude because the Solitude gets to be a good attacker, plus is a good target flickering. And at this point, I don't think that their concern is their mana situation. Feels like they already have a lot of lands. They do choose to Solitude our Emperor of Bones, and I'm going to recruit it for the Emperor of Bones just to kind of continue looping these Solitudes and the card advantage. And I'm going to offer the trade for their Solitude here by attacking into their Ren and 6, which again, I don't think matters their concern, so they don't really need this Ren and 6, but they do have a Boseiju in the bin that they might want to use to deal with my Overlord. They do buy back Boseiju here, and I draw Aven Interrupter. I play Emperor of Bones, eating a Solitude so I can Solitude the Reflection of Kikijiki, because I really don't want that thing coming out. Worth noting that if my opponent interacted with the Emperor of Bones here with their last card in hand, I was holding up mana to activate it again in response to make sure that it goes through. And here I made a misplay. I cast the Aether Vial thinking I can't play the Aven Interrupter for 2 mana anyway, but I knew about the Boseiju, so I should have actually just not bothered with this because the game's probably coming to a close. My opponent's low on clock, we're both low on cards in hand, and them Boseijuing means that it puts a land into play for me to hold up Aven Interrupter if I hadn't cast this Aether Vial, and they kind of are incentivized to Boseiju to deal with the Overlord before it comes off impending. Thankfully, my opponent had nothing there, so I wasn't punished, and I top deck Flickerwisp, which isn't crazy impressive, so I do choose to draw a card of Silent Clearing, find an Overlord of the Balemurk, and I finish off their Ren and 6 with the White Orchid, which they can't block. I choose not to attack with the 4/4 Emperor of Bones, mostly because I want to keep this Goblin Shaman at bay. Again, mana probably isn't our opponent's concern here, so I could have maybe attacked in and just let them attack with this to get this treasure freely, but there's no real reason to. I feel like I'm in control here. I've got Aven Overlord coming down, hitting the Overlord here, buying back a Solitude just in case, and holding up the Aven Interrupter of Flash Fade. I could have played Flickwisp, like Flickwisp the Overlord, but ultimately I think holding up Aven's better. They attack with the Goblin Shaman, I eat it with the Emperor of Bones, and they immediately start tapping mana like crazy. And Green Sun Zenith for 7, which is going to get the Atraxa we saw in game 1, which Aven Interrupter just stops. And as I've said many times, X spells versus Aven Interrupter absolutely dominates X spells. So, you know, next turn they'd be able to cast from plot, but X would have to be 0. They've already got the Dried Up, so they're getting literally no value off it. And my opponent scoops it up to the Aven Interrupter. So that is 2-1 against Omnath. Let's get on to match number 2. Okay, match number 2, we are on the draw against what turns out to be an Asmo Food Affinity kind of deck. This is a one-lander that holds up push and Ephemerate, but nothing else. I am on the draw, so I could potentially hit a second land to start doing Overlord of the Balemurk stuff. I think it's a little risky, so we do mellow one-lander, and we keep a reasonable 6 bottom the Skyclave Apparition because it is a one-off tutor target, which is always a fine metric to go by. Like, it's a one-off, I don't know the matchup, so I'm assuming that I don't necessarily need it, and if I do, I can tutor for it later. Everything else in the hand kind of does stuff. I could have played on the Boggart Trawler tapped here to save some life in the future potentially, but with no second white source, I do choose to play at the Marsh Flats in case I draw a second white and want to play Phantom on turn 2, if it's a matchup where that might be something I'm interested in. Pitchcast Solitude to get rid of the Emery, because Emerys are kill on sight. You just can't let an opponent untap with an Emery, especially if they got Mishra's Ball already in play, or, you know, things like that in their deck. And the Phantom was the easy choice to pitch to the Solitude. So here we're going to get to hold up Phelia into turn 3 Recruiter of the Guard, which seems reasonable. And my opponent used their blood token to discard a card to get their Asmo on. I flash in Phelia in their end step, draw an untapped land, try the Boggart Trawler anyway, but it's less painful. I recruit it for a white card because I need to kill this Asmo because I can't let it start making food to try and kill my Phelia. So tutoring for a Phelia with Recruiter makes sense because I don't want to top deck redundant Phelias because they're legendary. And as always, we get to attack with Phelia, blink the Recruiter to get a little bit more value. I choose to get Skyclave Apparition here because Solitude requires us to draw another white card, and Skyclave just going to get to take out the scariest thing they play regardless of what we top deck. So it felt very safe here. Okay, here, attacking with Phelia some more, flickering Recruiter. I do pay 3 to play the Boggart Box so I can get the Aether Vial into play. And I chose to get Aven here because I kind of wasn't sure what I wanted, so I figured Aven would protect me against even their strongest cards. I cast Thoughtcast, I let them cast it because it's only going to cost them 2 mana next turn anyway, which maybe was a mistake, maybe I just had to slam the Aven on the first thing that comes up, but my opponent tapped out for Cannoneer, so I will interrupt that, but it's only going to delay it for a turn, so I need to hope we can draw out of this a little bit, and my opponent is able to get an Asmo into play and kill Phelia. So here we'll use the Skyclave to take out the Asmo and get him through their creatures, and our opponent gets to play the Cannoneer from plot, still improvising, and has a second Cannoneer to follow up. So I draw a Solitude here and could, you know, pitch cast Solitude, pay 4 to kill one of the Kappas, but then I've still got to find a way to deal with the other Kappa. Instead, I just choose to play a Recruit and get Emperor Bones to hopefully start clawing back into the game, but it's not looking good, so I just scoop it up and we move on to game number 2. Okay, our opponent's on Asmo Food, so with sideboarding, we definitely want the Artifact Hate package, so Stony Silence is going to turn off all of their little trinkets and everything, and seems really good. Kataki is going to tax them all, which again seems really good, and Wrath of the Sky is going to blow them all up, which also seems really good, so we definitely want all of these. Nothing else in the sideboard really interests me. Thoughtseize, maybe consideration, but that's about it. Surgical does kind of do something as well, but this is what we've gone with. And for cutting, because we brought in all these Artifact Hate spells, Stony Silence and Wrath of the Skies, especially Stony Silence, really hurt our Aether Vial, so we are going to trim all our Aether Vials. If we can resolve one of these, we don't really care about the speed we get off Aether Vial because this is going to slow our opponent right down. And I decided to trim White Orchid Phantom because our opponent's mana base isn't particularly vulnerable to it. With that said, they would be on Urza Saga, so White Orchid Phantom is nice in the Urza Saga matchups, but because we are bringing in all this, I feel like we're allowed to cut White Orchid Phantom here because Wrath of the Skies looks good into it. Stony Kataki less so, but I decided to cut the White Orchid Phantoms here. Maybe that was incorrect. Maybe I should have, you know, cut Emperor Bones instead, but this is what I went for, and let's see how it goes in game number 2. So for game number 2, we're on the play. This hand looks like it'd be really good if there was a second land. Without the second land being on the play, that's just too risky. We've got double Failure, double Overlord. You know, I'm pretty okay to mull this one and see what a 6 shows us. And the 6 is another one lander. It does have Solitude Scam available. You know, we could keep this in bottom of the Emperor of Bones. But if I don't draw a land, again, this hand kind of gets stuck. And if our opponent plays out a Kappa, I'm never going to be able to pay for it. So I do choose to mulligan this 6, hoping to find a 2-lander. And looking at our 5, it is another 1-lander. This time, the 1 land being a Boggart Trawler, which is a black source, Pain land. And this is just also uncapable. So we do mulligan again. And now we see a 4 that would have been amazing whether it was a 7, 6, a 5, or a 4. So kind of happy to keep this. Decide to keep 2 lands, specifically the 2 white sources, so we can cast Wrath of the Skies and the Fatal Push. So we're just hoping to get into a position where we can have a really impactful Wrath of the Skies. And having the fetch land here is nice as well because we can get the Survey land and try and improve our future draws to hopefully claw back into this game. And my opponent leads with what must be one of the craziest turn ones possible, where they play Saga, Cookbook, discard to make a food, play an Opal, play an Asmo, but Wrath of the Skies for 0 here is insane. Blows up matchup. Everything, including their land, leaves them with just a cookbook in play, so feeling really good about the position here. Also drawn into a second Wrath of the Skies, which is insane card in the matchup. And then we top deck a Flickerwisp, which is fine, but we need to start drawing lands and spells, so we're kind of in a rough spot here. We do find a third land. I feel like I'm pretty incentivized to Wrath of the Skies for one here, but I choose to delay the turn to see if maybe I can get more value out of it. Just flicker the Surveil land to look a little deeper, and my opponent plays Kappa, so maybe Wrath of the Skies for one would have blown up their cookbooks and kept the Kappa away for long enough, and they just start chonking in here with the Kappa. I have the Emperor of Bones, I get a Flickerwisp under it, which isn't hugely valuable, but it's something. And here I had a tough choice because my opponent hadn't played an artifact, so the Kappa could have been blocked. So I could have chump blocked with Emperor of Bones, but then that doesn't leave me in a good position for future turns. So they didn't have an artifact that turn, so there's a chance they also don't end up with an artifact next turn, but they do have a blood token draw and their normal draw. So it is risky. I did tank on that decision for a while and ultimately decided that I kind of just had to risk it because I was so far behind this game despite my really good Wrath of the Skies that I just went for it. My opponent pops the blood token here. I use the Emperor Bones to get the Flickerwisp in play here to flicker away a land. I don't know, just in the hopes that that stops them from casting something. But my opponent had the Mox Opal, so the Kappa is going to be unblockable and I'm going to be very dead. So that is match number 2 with a 0-2 loss to Asmo Food, which otherwise feels like shouldn't actually be that bad of a matchup. We just need to make sure we have ways to deal with Kappa Cannon here. But with that said, let's get on to match number 3. Match number 3, and we're paired against Ruby Storm. Not knowing the matchup, obviously, but this is a pretty slow hand, so we choose to mulligan. We are on the draw. This hand's defensible, so we do decide to keep. And our opponent just plays Bloodsail Mire, which gives us false sense of confidence, because if it's a mid-rangey kind of matchup, we're actually in an okay spot. They fetch Faerie Macabre and Surveil Passive Flame, so immediately very frightened. Our main deck doesn't really deal with Storm too well, and this hand especially doesn't look too impressive. I have the option here of holding up Fatal Push in case they play out Ral and try and start going off, but they did miss second land drop, so I'm somewhat hopeful. So instead I'm going to ramp myself to put me in a better position to start fighting them more effectively on future turns. And my opponent goes Pyretic Ritual into Ruby Medallion, so the Fatal Push wouldn't have mattered anyway for what it's worth, which is good to know. And they start casting spells. And it doesn't take long before I'm pretty happy to scoop it up and just move on to game number 2. Sideboarding against Ruby Storm. I want Thoughtseize to disrupt their hand and slow them down. Especially the really nice thing about Thoughtseize in this list is that we don't have a lot of turn 1 plays, so Thoughtseize being a turn 1 play is really nice, even though it might not be as disruptive as we'd like to be. It will slow them down enough that we can then start accruing value and slowing them down other ways, especially with the rest of our sideboard cards like Surgical Extraction, pretty good taking out their key cards. And we can also do it in response to, you know, Passing Flames or something, and Thoughtseize can put something in a surgical take, really nice. Faerie Macabre is going to be really good at picking their graveyard apart. Again, Passing Flames is the card we're trying to fight against. And the 2 Aven Interrupters. Aven Interrupter's static X at the bottom there. Spells your opponent's cast from graveyard to exile cost 2 generic more to cast. That just works against their deck really well. So if we can get an Aven Interrupter into play, it is going to undo all of their cost reduction effects. So definitely a card we want access to. As far as boarding out, I boarded out 3 White Orchid Phantoms because their mana base isn't particularly vulnerable to it. Instead, White Orchid Phantoms role in this matchup would be more so to ramp ourselves with blowing up our own Flagstones, which is fine to keep in if you don't have the sideboard cards, but I am cutting it here. A single Ephemerate and a single Phelia, just trimming around the edges. I would also consider cutting a Recruiter the Guard, but I think recruiting for Faerie Macabre is a fine turn 3 play to tap out for sometimes, so I wanted to leave access to all my recruiters, and the Aether Vials we want to keep in for the speed. And then 3 Fatal Push, which Fatal Push can kill Ral, but ultimately because I'm leaving an all-4 Solitude, I don't really want to overcommit into ways to deal with Ral, and Skyclave Apparition is a really good answer to Ral and Ruby Medallion. I could have potentially thought about cutting Emperor of Bones, but I know that Ruby Storm often boards into Flage, which I wanted to kind of have a better out to, even though I brought in all this Grave Hate, so this is potentially a card we could have cut as well, something to consider for the future, but this is how I sideboarded for this match, so let's see how we go going into game number 2. Game number 2, we get to be on the play this time. So here we have the choice of Thoughtseize or Aether Vial on turn 1. We go for Aether Vial. The earlier we get Aether Vial, the better it is. And we Thoughtseize and see our opponent's hand, which is a bunch of rituals and Flage and Wear Tear. So I ultimately take the Wear Tear to protect my Aether Vial. I don't want to put Flage in the bin, and everything else is kind of redundant. Grape Shot, if it's in the bin, I can maybe Surgical or something. But ultimately getting the Vial into play with Recruiter in hand and our opponent having the Wear Tear available to take out the Aether Vial lets us start playing Recruiter and vialing in the things we recruit it for. I Faerie Macabre for value there because I have the option to use Overlord of the Balemurk to buy it back, and instead I choose to hold up Vial for Recruiter to tutor for Aven to interact with them. So here my opponent plays at the Ral. I'm just going to Aven Interrupter the Metamorphose, which isn't the ideal thing to Aven Interrupter necessarily, but just getting the Aven Interrupter into play puts its static ability into play, which is something we really want in this matchup. And my opponent just fires off a medium grave shot to wipe out our board. So here I choose to hold up the same line, and my opponent plays out a few spells, doesn't really do well in the coin flips with Raoul, and seemingly runs out of gas and is just over it and concedes here. Let's get on to the third and final game against Ruby Storm. Alright, game number 3 on the draw against Ruby Storm, which is a scary prospect. This is a no-lander, even with Surgical and Vial. I just don't like running the risk of having to have one draw to find the land we need, so we do mulligan, keep 6 and bottom of the third land, and we keep mostly on the strength of Surgical Extraction, but if our opponent goes for a fast combo, Surgical is going to be pretty great at disrupting them. My opponent just plays out a Rebellion, passes back. I'm going to Surveil. I put Failure in the bin. I could have left it on the top to try and use Failure and Overlord, but ultimately I'm happy to just impending the Overlord. The Overlord is going to buy back the Failure just in case we do go for that line later, but we also just have 2 Surgicals up now, which is really good in the matchup. My opponent has Metamorphose into Ren's Resolve and just passes back to us, and I'm choosing to use this turn to hold up the Failure to flicker the Overlord. Plus it also threatens holding up Aven Interrupter, stuff like that, so maybe makes our opponent think about their plays. They do have a Pass in Flames in exile from their Ren's Resolve, so they are going to go for it here. In response, I Surgical, starting with the Ren's Resolve, and I make a mistake here and don't click the Ren's Resolve in the bin that I initially targeted, so I make sure to do it properly with the Metamorphose, but they do get to flash back their Ren's Resolve that I didn't click on. But we get Failure into play here, play out a Recruiter of the Guard to shoot for Faerie Macabre to threaten more Grave Hate, and we do take out their last spells that were left in the graveyard, including a Pass in Flames. Failure flickers the Balemurk, buys back the Faerie Macabre, which we get to hold up, and our opponent starts chaining off spells, plays a Glimpse, plays a Raoul, flips the Raoul, and uses the Raoul and the Flage that they found to take out the Overlord of the Balemurk, which is good for them. They needed to take out the Overlord, but I'm not too scared of. We still haven't drawn a way to really interact with that combo, but we're in a good spot. We use Faerie to take out the Flage and another card from their bin. Emperor Bones is going to pull back the Overlord, which pulls back Faerie, and I choose to do this. Failure blinks the Scion so I can get through for damage. Overlord finds me an Aven Interrupter, which will be really good for next turn. We've killed the Raoul, and because our opponent did a mid combo there, I feel like they shouldn't be able to combo too well on the following turn. And they cast Flage, which they have the mana and the resources have been to escape it once it goes away, and I don't get priority there. So once it is sacrificed, I will be in a bad spot. So I choose to pitch cast Solitude here to get rid of it, to make sure that it will never hit the graveyard. And my opponent scoops it to that. So that is match number 3 in the bag. Let's get on to match number 4. So match number 4, we're versing Goryos. We keep a 2-laner with a Vial, no black sources yet. So this is where our low percentage of black sources might look a little painful. We do get Thoughtseize. Our opponent takes the Aether Vial because it's the smartest thing to take. Here's where the White Orchid Phantom creates black sources by blowing up Flagstones, getting Basic Swamp, getting Shadowy Backstreet. But again, in matchups where we bought out the Phantom, that line isn't available to us. So worth noting that this is a game where we might have missed out on black sources here. Now, my opponent's got a Frog under the Emperor Bones, which I kind of want to play around the Frog. So here, during their second main phase, I Fatal Push the Emperor Bones to get rid of the Frog. They choose to use the Emperor Bones to put the Frog into play here, so they can use the Frog as a discard source to put their Atraxa in their bin. It gets to the end step, they Goryos the Atraxa, and I choose to pitch card Solitude, which the Atraxa would go away in my end step anyway, so this probably wasn't necessary, but they do use Flare of Denial to counter my Solitude. I just play out Emperor Bones here, eat my Solitude to have it available to me later, and pass back to my opponent. Here they have Leyline Binding for Emperor. The Solitude does nothing, so I don't really need to bring it back here. I'm just going to let that happen. And my opponent has a Kiora. The Kiora sets up their next turn by putting a Grizzlebrand in bin, but I had a second Emperor Bones. Again, if I didn't have 2 black sources, this would be pretty rough. Emperor Bones gets to steal their Grizzlebrand. And as I said in the last video, this beginning of combat stop means that the turn I played the Emperor, I've also adapted still, because it activates in the beginning of combat. I've activated while still in the beginning of combat so that I can attack with this nice new Grizzlebrand that I've got. So we hit the Grizzlebrand, gain 7 life, and draw a bunch of cards. I feel like I punted this end step a little, so I chose to Solitude Ephemerate to gain 7 life off getting rid of my Grizzlebrand because I just paid too much life, but also get rid of their Kiora so they can't attack and make a big creature. My plan maybe should have changed when I didn't find a second Solitude in case they had a backup threat, because that was why I was digging so deep, was to try and find a Solitude to make sure they couldn't reanimate something else, but they would need a Fatty, a way to discard it, and a reanimation spell. They play the Falagi, don't really hit with it, and they choose to scoop it up there. So let's get on to game number 2. Okay, playing against Goryos Vengeance, a graveyard heavy deck. We want all of our graveyard hate spells, surprisingly. So the Surgical's really good. We'll just take out all their Atraxas at once. Faerie Macabre can spot remove something when a Goryos is trying to target it. Especially nice that they don't really have a way to deal with this, because they have counter spells and stuff, but that doesn't deal with this activated ability from our hand, like, you know, similar to a channel ability or something. And then 3 Thoughtseize to just try and pull their hand apart and and disrupt their ability to combo, because they are a combo deck, so we want to disrupt that. And as far as boarding out White Orchid Phantom, their meta base is actually somewhat vulnerable to this, but I don't think we have the time to get away with it, and this card is otherwise just kind of average in the matchup. We can keep it in if need to be, but everything else we kind of wanted to keep in. Trim the Skyclave Apparition, which is our one-off tutor target. We could have kept this in to deal with Psychic Frog, but for Solitude, 3 Fatal Push, I kind of feel okay about our ability to deal with Psychic Frog, but again, this is something that we could keep in as a tutor target if need be. Similar to the previous matchup against Ruby Storm, I want to leave in all 4 recruiters, because recruiting Faerie Macabre against a graveyard focus deck is something I'd like to try and do. So because this is a turn 3 play, this costs no mana, I do leave on all recruiters when Faerie Macabre's in most of the time. Trimming a Phelia because it just doesn't really attack well, and there's not a lot of effects we really need to flicker, and they should have a fair chunk of removal, so we can trim 1, even though Failure is a really nice card in the deck. And Aether Vial will trim 1. Our opponent does have some number of counterspells. We're not too afraid of them, not to the point where we're going to try and like play off our vials and not cast up any counterspells. They don't have enough counterspells for us to really worry about that, I don't believe, so we are trimming 1 here. This is how we will be proceeding into game number 2 against Goryos. Game number 2, we're on the draw. We keep a 7 with lands and spells, one of which is Surgical, so pretty happy with this hand. And we draw into the Overlord, so now we also have our Splinter Twin combo of Failure into Overlord, or our other combo of Failure into Recruiter of the card. Now, their Pelagi hits Atraxa, and they also get an Ephemerate off of it, so I probably should have Surgical at some point here. Taking out the Atraxas is good enough. The thing is, they still have Exuberant that they can Goryos. I wasn't sure if they might have had Ulamog or anything else like that, so I did choose to hold on to it, kind of leaving it up as an answer for later on. But they have counterspells, which the counterspells are free, so maybe it's kind of the same. You know, they can just sack the Pelagi for a Flare of Denial, but I maybe should have fired off the Surgical at some point. So we flash in the Failure, and I choose to cast Recruiter here because I want to make sure that I get Faerie Macabre, because Faerie Macabre can't be countered, can't really be interacted with any cards from their deck, so they play the Emperor of Bones, they target the Atraxa. I fire off the Surgical here to kind of see what my opponent's going to do about it. They exile it with other cards with the Psychic Frog to give it flying. So here I just choose to pitch cast Solitude to get rid of the Psychic Frog. I just don't want them drawing cards and essentially having it out. They do Ephemerate the Frog, which is maybe their worst Ephemerate target, but they are choosing to keep it around. And I play out Overlord of the Balemurk here, so I could have played it the previous turn, but again, I wanted to make sure I got Faerie Macabre. I rebuy the Solitude. I'm going to flicker the Overlord of the Balemurk. My opponent tries to use the Psychic Frog to fight the Failure. Again, I just want this Frog gone. I don't want them getting value out of it, so I am just going to pitch cast Solitude again to deal with the Psychic Frog. I could have done it before the Frog blocked. I didn't want them blocked with the Emperor of Bones and threatened to eat my Failure. So we may have spent a lot of cards dealing with that Psychic Frog, but it stopped our opponent from gaining cards from the Psychic Frog, so kind of happy with that interaction. Plus, it's a discard outlet and a way to protect them from my Surgicals and Faerie Macabres, so their Emperor of Bones tries to eat my Solitude, so I Faerie Macabre myself, keep them from having access to it. They have another Psychic Frog, and my Failure attack is going to blink Recruiter to tutor. My Overlord attack is rebuying Solitude, and my opponent just scoops it up to the crazy attrition war that I'm winning here. So that is match number 4 in the bag. Let's get on to the 5th and final match of the league. Okay, match number 5, we're against Domain Zoo. This is a 5-lander, one of which is a spell, but a slow spell, but we have Fatal Push into Overlord, so I feel like the Overlord should hopefully buy us out of this. We do draw another land, so this could have been a mulligan, but our deck wants to slow the game out to get to a point where we get to a lot of lands, so I don't actually hate it because we have the Overlord. If we got hand-hated there, that would have been pretty rough, so maybe a mull, maybe not. Opponent plays out a Psychic Frog, we're just going to Fatal Push it. At this point, I actually haven't worked out what our opponent's on because their mana base is wild, and they're playing Psychic Frog. They play out Sign of Draco, so I realize they're on some kind of domain deck, but because they kind of tapped out, I get to flash in Failure, and then because we kept a hand with all these lands and a Witch Enchanter, we get to blow up the Sign of Draco, and now Failure attack gets to blink the Overlord of the Balemurk. We're just going to rebuy White Orchid Phantom because their mana base is purely vulnerable to it, plus we have Pitch Cast Solitude available. My opponent bolts the Failure, bindings the Overlord, so they've had removal to take away all the pressure I had in play, except for this piddly little Witch Enchanter, but I'm going to Phantom support their Spires. Maybe their Blood Crypt was a better choice as potentially they're only black cells, but with Psychic Frog, I assume black's actually a higher percentage, and Spires just has 3 colors on, so just kind of Unga Bunga blow up the land that's got the most colors on it, you know? And I play Flickerwisp, which will be able to flick the Witch Enchanter, blow up the Leyline Binding, get back the Overlord, and keep the card advantage swimming, so my opponent is happy to scoop it up there. Let's get on to game number 2. Alright, going into game number 2 against Domain Zoo. Looking at our sideboard, I don't really like Aven's here, because the matchup tends to be pretty fast. Wrap the Skies doesn't always hit if they have like Scion and stuff, Kataki, it's only do nothing. Surgical, it's really only against Flage. Same with Faerie. I probably should think about bringing Faerie. Thoughtseize, it's too painful and they're too aggro for me to really want that. I do like to disrupt their mana with Orchid Phantom. So this is how I sideboard is I just brought in the Phantom and trimmed one Aether Vial. Because they do have Leyline Binding and stuff, and as much as I would like to try and match them on speed, a lot of the time we're just going to, you know, Solitude and then try and scam it or rebuy with Overlord or Emperor Bones or something. So I don't think we need to be fast in the matchup. Ideally, Faerie Macabre's probably worth having Flage, but it's so mid against them otherwise, and we do have 3 Emperor Bones, so I'm kind of okay with just boarding like this, and maybe if there's another card you really don't want, then you can board in the Faerie Macabre. So with that said, let's get on to game number 2 against Domain Zoo. I mulled this one land that has 3 Phelias in it. It's nice having Overlord and Phelia, and I have 2 draw steps to draw to a land, but I also need to draw to specifically a black source. Again, maybe the Punisher running the Flagstones mana base, but I don't think I'm keeping this anyway, so mulligan, and we keep a 1-lander that's a bit more reasonable because Aether Vial is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting here. Plus we already have the Concealed Courtyard, so any land lets us play this Overlord on turn 2. And we bottomed the second Flickerwisp, because with only 1 land, if we miss land drops, playing it 2 Aether Vials seems very reasonable, whereas the second Flickerwisp is going to take a while to be relevant. Our opponent has the Leyline of Guild opener, which is great for them, and they choose to just fetch a shock land, which is kind of weird, and they play out a Psychic Frog, so I'm guessing they just had no turn on play, but it's weird they didn't get its Veiland when the Leyline of the Guild Pack's in play, but I guess they're worried about Witch Enchanter. My hand hasn't gotten any better at dealing with Psychic Frog, so we just get to play another Vial and hope that the card advantage from this Frog isn't going to completely run us over in this game. Alright, we get to tick our Vial up to 2, so we finally have a play in Vialing the Phelia, but nothing else because their hand's full of 3 drops and a 5 drop, so we're just going to hang out here, get ready to Vial in this Phelia in the end step, and I hope we get to untap with it and get some value. We keep getting hit by frogs, our opponents just improving their position. Our deck is so good at attrition and card advantage and card quality and everything, but our opponents getting off to a pretty good start, but they are meant to be the aggressor in the matchup, and they're definitely not being aggressive. I try to Vial something in so I can get value off the Phelia. My opponent has Lightning Bolt for the Phelia, so I'm just going to Recruiter, get Witch Enchanter so I get a land drop so I can play the Overlord, the Balemurk. Maybe greedy, maybe I was just meant to get Solitude, but my hope was just that Overlord would get Solitude. Because my opponent's drawn enough cards and I missed land drops for enough turns, I just kind of decided to go for the riskier play, because if we get there, it puts us back in the game in a really good way. And my opponent gives a Psychic Frog flying so we can't chop block with the Recruiter, which was 100% my plan, and I just pitch cast Solitude to get rid of it. If they didn't give it flying there and make me Solitude, I was going to untap with 2 Vials on 3, so I could Vial, put Recruiter, and get Flickerwisp, pitch cast Solitude, Vial and Flickerwisp to flicker the Solitude to get it to hang around in play. But ultimately, I think we're in a good enough spot where we are getting really good card advantage. I think I was meant to tick my second Vial up to 3 here so I could recruit a Flickerwisp to flicker the Overlord. But with that said, my opponent actually hasn't put any pressure on except for the Psychic Frog. So with the Frog gone, I don't really care about just sitting in this board state and waiting for my Overlord to come online. My opponent has Bolt for Aven. They dash over Ragavan. I activate Vial here just to kind of make them scared, the fact that they dash their Ragavan. And if I tick my Vial up to 3, I could have put a Recruiter in and blocked. So maybe this tells me they have a removal spell. I tick my first Vial up to 4 so that I can recruit it for a Witch Enchanter and Vial it in, which will get rid of the Leyline Binding, which will bring back my Emperor Bones. I also get the option of Witch Enchanter to blow up the Leyline of the Guild Pact if they have a Sign of Drake on the next turn that I need to deal with. The Ragavan appears to have lost all hope because it's just attacking into our Recruiter and willingly trading with it, which might be something we think about differently if we didn't have a backup Recruiter, but they just Trouble Flames to hit us for some damage. I Vial in the Witch Enchanter to get back my Emperor Bones because I do have an Overlord in the bin, so the Emperor Bones exiles the Overlord. I get to adapt, put the Overlord into play. Overlord buys back a Solitude with the Vial we've just ticked up to 5, and an open mana for the Ephemerate we've got in hand. And we also, with our Overlord attack, get to pull back the Aven Interrupter to hold that up on the other Vial in case my opponent has something scary on their next turn. My opponent has Arena of Glory. They play out the Flage, which they would be able to escape, but I just get to Aven it. So my opponent is very dead to my board state, and they scoop it up. So we win that game 2-0, and we 4-1 the league. So let's go to the post-league wrap-up. Alright, so that was another 4-1 league with this list. Really liking how this is all playing. Again, we kind of really like Phelia and Flickerwisp getting to abuse this Overlord, you know, and impending it for 2, and then all of a sudden it's a 5-5, like we spent 5 mana on it. Really nice. I think that league kind of showed a little bit of everything, where White Orchid Phantom looked good, Emperor Bones looks amazing. This card, this is is almost a kill on side. If you can adapt this, it's big trouble for your opponent. We haven't even really done any shenanigans with like Phelia or Flickerwisp or Ephemerate resetting the Emperor Bones so we can use it multiple times, or resetting the thing we bring back with Emperor Bones to remove the finality counter. Just doing it once is kind of enough a lot of the time, because a lot of the time it's filling a hole that our opponents punched in their plan, where we've flashed in Phelia, we've untapped and jammed Overlord, and they've killed Phelia. So then the following turn, on turn 4, we play Emperor Bones, get back to Phelia, attack, blink the Overlord, and now it doesn't matter that Emperor Bones can't act again, because the Overlord's going to keep attacking, providing card advantage. So really cool. The mana base, I didn't feel like it was particularly painful. I still really like White Orchid Phantom Flagstones interaction. Concealed Courtyards, they do sometimes come in tapped when you don't want them to, but you know, sometimes you might just hold your land drop, and if you've got nothing to do with all of your mana, you can just play it as a tap land instead of playing an untapped land or something. But also a lot of the time I found that I kind of had enough attrition in a lot of games where there might have been a good thing to do on a certain turn with all my mana, but instead there are other things I can do using less mana to play at the Concealed Courtyard. So haven't felt particularly punished by it yet, although I could absolutely understand not wanting to have these. My concern would be if there was more fetch lands, you would run out of fetchables pretty quick with milling yourself with Overlord. And we have Godless Shrine 3 playing Shadowy Backstreet and a Swamp, so kind of reasonable it could run out of fetchables, but not really something I'm super concerned with. I just want to see how good this card could be. As for the sideboard, Wrath the Sky still seems really good. If we hadn't mulled to 4 against the food deck, I think we could have got there. We just needed to, you know, get well enough into the game to be able to answer Kappa Canopy and pay for ward, or to keep our opponent off of enough permanents that they couldn't put Kappa into play. Faerie Macabre, still really impressive. Surgical and Thoughtseize are great to have access to, even if I'm not always playing the smartest with Surgical Extraction at the moment, but I am not used to playing black cards really, so we'll see how we go with more reps with these. Kataki, really good on paper. Stonies, it should be really good on paper, but the cost of turning off our Aether Vials is pretty real, so we will see how we feel about these. The Avens, really like Avens. I could almost see like just having 2 in the main, none in the board, but with 1 in the main, I like being able to bring in more. Same with the Phantom. If we could fit the 4th one main, that'd be great, but otherwise, I do still like having access to the 4th in the board for the matchups where it is really good. So pretty happy with the list. Let me know if you've been trying this list and what you think of it, or if you have any suggestions for tweaks I could make to the list. My first thought is that I kind of want to put this Phantom main, want to find room for the 4th Flickerwisp. I would like room for a second Aven Interrupter and or a second Skyclave main, but there's just no room for it considering everything else. Like, I don't want to trim Ephemerates, definitely don't want to trim Vials, definitely don't want to trim Failures, don't want to trim Recruiter. Like, most of the 4-ofs that I have here are pretty necessary 4-ofs, so I think Emperor Bones I like as a 3-off. I don't really want a 4th copy, but it is my favorite card in the deck so far, so maybe I do want to find a 4th copy, but I think the role it serves is really important and really strong, but I don't think that means it has to be a 4-off, so kind of happy to keep testing 3. As always, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the league. Let me know what you thought, and until next time, bye-zy.